second in the President's series of events. I'm delighted to welcome you all back again and hoping this will continue to build. I'm John Beckford. I think you all know me now, and I'm the current president of the Cybernetics Society. And I shall say it again now everybody's here. Wherever Doug Haynes is hiding on my screen, Doug is responsible for me being here. So thank you, Doug. It's been a long time, hasn't it? The purpose of these events is to bring the well-kept secret of the Cybernetics Society out of the sort of darkened corners in which it's hidden since about 1960 something or other, and engage, inform, entertain in various forms, both its own members and those who are not yet members, as Angus would have it, of the society, but who we hope to attract in as members. And the basis of that is having to have some sort of conversation, both with ourselves and with the world around us, about the things that matter in cybernetics and that cybernetics matters too. So consequently, we end up with a sort of an interesting contrast of people, both listening and joining in and indeed contributing to the events. But our purpose as a learned society is, of course, to find out more about our own subject and to propagate it to other people. So we are engaged in an activity of sustaining our identity and fulfilling our purpose as an organization by engaging in this stuff. I'd like to invite you all to be challenging, to ask awkward questions, and the more awkward they are, the better. And if you haven't got a question, at least make a comment. Had some really good comments back after the last event. Some of them might have been better asked during it, because one of the major critiques of any learned society is that it indulges itself in a sort of arcane and obscure language, which is designed to say, I'm a member and you're not. And of course, one of the things, if a subject is going to be useful to the world around itself, it has to be able to engage with that world and use, either explain its language or share its language with other people. So and I've read the script of what Ben's likely to say, and I know what Louise is likely to say because they sent it to me in advance, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be some arcane and obscure language in at least one of those two presentations as we go along. We're going to move to Ben in just a second. So you can either stick your questions into the chat space, or you can, at the end, when Ben has finished, stick a thumbs up so that I know you want to say something. If you want to make a comment is fine. If you want to ask a question is fine. Either thing works really well for us. So Ben, I think Ben is talking tonight about undeciding the decidable, and Ben is a teacher at the University of Brighton, with a subject matter, I think, of architecture and interest in design, or the other way around, and has come to cybernetics through that route. I think Ben's talk is going to be deep and thoughtful and highly reflective and quite theoretical, I suspect, whereas Louise, speaking shortly afterwards, is probably going to be more practical and empirical, concerned with applications of ideas. So in the one case with Ben, what we're going to have to try and do is explore at the end the relevance of what Ben says to the world outside cybernetics. What I think we're going to have to do with Louise a little later on is think about what is that she has to say that has something to say to the cybernetics community. And so the end point of tonight is to try and join those two somewhat different threads together. So if you're ready to start, Ben, and I'm ready to hand over, but if you could push the appropriate buttons, Angus, that would be great. If you all go on to mute now while Ben speaks, that will be great. Thank you.
Sure, I don't have any slides or anything. I'm just going to talk through this, these ideas. So this is work in progress. So it's stuff that I'm only not completely sure of myself. So I'm very interested in the feedback on this. And it's also probably at the edge of some thinking. So I think, as John has sort of intimated, this is going to be very much within certain discourses within cybernetics. There's a little bit of a risk of it becoming what I've learned from my American colleagues is called insider baseball, but I'm going to try and avoid that, hopefully. So I'm Ben, and I teach architecture and design at the University of Brighton. And the short context of me would be I'm one of the many people who's encountered cybernetics through architectural education in the UK, which is a tradition that relates particularly to Gordon Pask and students of his. And my supervisor was someone called Ranulph Glanville, who many of you will know. And this is, some of the thinking here is inspired by some of my conversations with him, which isn't to say he will agree with me. I don't think he would in some places, or he wouldn't share the same thoughts. One of the reasons why cybernetics is of interest in design is because both design and cybernetics speak to the theme of purpose. And purpose is one of the things that I'm most interested in. So design we can think of as an attempt to move from existing situations to preferred ones. So we could think of it as pursuing purposes, being critical about how we do that. Cybernetics, if you think of what the main contribution of cybernetics makes initially when it's developed as a field, this is about recovering and reintroducing the notion of purpose into scientific discourse, which had been replaced by very mechanical linear notions of cause and effect. So purpose reappears. And I don't see what cybernetics is as a technical subject concerned with increasing the effectiveness of the pursuit of purposes or pursuit of goals, but rather as a critical discourse through which what it means to act purposefully can be understood. And the consequences of doing that can be explored. You can see this even at the outset. So I don't think this is a first order, second order, blah, blah, blah distinction. At the very outset, you can see what's happening is that there are questions about circular causality, cybernetic questions, that arise through reflection on the development of technologies. It's not the other way around. So we don't have a theoretical discourse looking for practical or technological application. We have a critical discourse that's arising because of technologies and practices and so on. And I think cybernetics in this sense is really important because, or it not being merely a kind of instrumental practice, because the instrumental pursuit of purposes, even where this is well-meaning, underlines many of the challenges and problems we have in the world. So as well as design and cybernetics, there's a third discourse that's concerned with purpose that I'll speak to today, and that's ethics. And ethics we could think of as concerned with which purposes to pursue. So ideas of the good, which is similar, slightly different to ideas of goal, but similar to ideas of purpose. And I see ethics as concerned with which to pursue, but also how to mediate the conflicts that arise in doing so. In design, there's a tendency to treat ethics as a source of authority to be applied to design questions, where designers are stuck, right? So see this in various books in architecture, for instance. But if you look at ethical philosophy more closely, it doesn't offer clear guidance. We receive radically different advice depending on which frameworks we invoke. So if we characterize a situation in terms of consequences, we get one piece of advice. If we characterize it in terms of duties, we get another. If we think in terms of character, we get another. Some work in architectural ethics basically uses different frameworks to apply where they're more easy, right? So we apply the frameworks where they make most sense, but this also is quite arbitrary because we could apply each one to anything. By ethics, I should say at this point that I don't mean ethical values. We use ethics to mean several different things. I think this gets confused and these things need to be pulled apart. I mean the discourses that we use to mediate values or mediate value conflicts. And I think it's important to clarify that, and I'll try and be precise. I tend to use ethics just to mean the discourse. Where I mean something else, I'll try and be precise about that. I think we need new ways to approach the ethical, and I think cybernetics and design have some contributions to make here, which isn't to say that those contributions are necessarily going to be earth-shattering. They may be quite modest, but I think there's something they can contribute. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on one particular very influential paper, which is one of the key pieces of work that explores the relationship between cybernetics and ethics, which is Heinz von Foerster's Ethics and Second Order Cybernetics. Heinz von Foerster is a Austrian emigre to the United States who's involved at the outset of cybernetics, is particularly connected to a shift called second order cybernetics, which arises from the application of cybernetics to itself. This is a talk he gave in 1990, which was published a year later. And the talk is in the context of family therapy, and he was asked to talk about ethics, I think. And this was the first encounter I had with cybernetics. This is the first paper I read. I was interested in ethical questions in design, and I was approaching that before this in a kind of Sartrean framework, and this was a way of opening up, and I'll say a little bit to that later on. Now, what I think many of you may be familiar with this paper, some of you won't, that there are several versions published. I'd really recommend getting hold of it if you haven't read it. I'm going to try and explain it, explain how I understand it, so it doesn't matter if you haven't read it. Every time I go back to this paper, I understand something different by it. And this is partly because I'm returning and reading again, I see something new. But I think this is something quite special in it, and I think it's afforded by the way in which it's written. Heinz von Foerster is very quotable. You can have entire cybernetics panel discussions quoting Heinz von Foerster. You know, I'm sure you may have been in one. But sometimes he's quoted as if quoting him answers a question. I don't think that's the right way to use what he's written. I think it's more appropriate to take his words as questions or provocations, as things that require us to take a position. And I think the reason why I can go back to this paper and see different things is some of the things he said speak on a number of levels. So as we'll see, this idea that we should take this as questions rather than answers is consistent with what he says. That will become clear later. But I should say that I'm not especially interested in analysing what Heinz von Foerster means, so I'm not trying to do that. I'm using his provocations to develop new thinkings, which I don't think he'd agree with. Okay. The paper, Ethics and Second Order Cybernetics, is organised in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. The first part concerns the difficulty of articulating ethics. That is, the way in which ethical principles require action of us, not words, and the way that when we talk about ethics, this shift into language can transform the ethical into moralization. I'll return to this point. The other 2 parts of the paper introduce ways in which to navigate the challenge of articulating ethics. And today I'm concentrating on just one of those, which von Foerster titles Metaphysics. But this is where he introduces the idea of undecidability. The third part, the second way he gives us to navigate the question of articulating ethics, is where he talks about dialogue and conversation. And I'm not going to get on to that today, but you might be able to see where this would fit in. Okay, so the articulation of ethics. Heinz von Foerster begins this by quoting his fellow Viennese Wittgenstein, and in his own translation. It is clear that ethics cannot be articulated. What this means is that ethics demands actions of us, not descriptions of actions. So if ethics requires me to do something, it doesn't really require me to tell you about it, right? And you can think of examples here, such as, so moralization is the one that von Foerster uses. We might think of virtue signaling as well here. Heinz von Foerster describes two approaches to the ethical. So in one, this is about I shall not. This he refers to as ethics, which is slightly different to how I'm saying ethics. And for me, this is not a question of values, it's a question of ethical questioning. But the point is, it's personal, it's about what I should do. And his general position we could summarize as ethics should be kept implicit in my actions. So it should guide my actions, but it should be implicit in them. The second, which he refers to as morals, is thou shalt, characterized by thou shalt not. So this is where someone tells someone else what they should do. And the point here is not that really one is called ethics and one is called morals. Ethics and morals mean overlapping things in English. I tend to use morality or moralization or moral codes to be more precise to what von Foerster means by morals. Now, he sees this as two dispositions, one towards the self and one towards others. And he's pushing us towards, or tempting us towards, really addressing ourselves and our own actions, rather than talking about ethics and legislating for others, which he sees as moralization. Now, I don't think, this is where I'll start to differ from him slightly, I don't think it's so clear-cut. So I don't think what he's saying is as clear-cut as he thinks it is. And this is partly because of my background in architecture, which is a discipline that has consequences for when my actions as an architect have consequences for others, including others that I can't meet. So if you consider, I might design a building for a client, but it might really be for a user who's not my client. But also I'm currently living in a building that was built before I was born and no one asked me about it. So the consequences I have as an architect are always for others. And this is what the profession does. I can't divide my ethical requirements into those that are for me and those that are for others. So there are a few things to clarify first. First one of these, it's not a matter. So the I shall, thou shall distinction that von Foerster gives us, the ethics morals distinction, if you like, it's not a matter of qualifying my statements as I. Von Foerster does imply this in some places. I think he's wrong. If I start talking about what I should do, this is still a description, this is still an articulation, and this rebounds onto others. But I just qualify this as, well, I think I should do this. This is still rebounding onto the people I'm talking to. It's not about how these things are verbalized, it's about whether they're actions. Secondly, keeping ethics implicit cannot mean staying silent or bounding ethics to the personal. Again, von Foerster, I don't think he necessarily means silence, but he certainly sees this as keeping this to the personal. I think silence is an action, and it's an action through which we become complicit. Thirdly, there are situations where ethics requires articulation from us. So we could, architecture is my example for this. But for instance, consider the difference between, so you remember von Foerster has I shall do X versus thou shall do X. Consider I shall support you do X. I shall support you to do X versus you should do X. I shall resist you doing Y, you should not do Y. So the first one's the responsibility I'm implying is still mine, even though I'm talking about something that's interpersonal. So I've explored some of those in through the lens of design and architecture and through the lens of conversation, drawing a little on Pasq, and I'm not going to get to that today. If you're interested in that aspect of things, I have some publications which I can send you if you'd like to get in touch with me. But I'm going to concentrate on, having kind of set that scene, I'm going to concentrate specifically on the notion of undecidability, which brings us to a question of responsibility. Heinz von Foerster talks about these two attitudes, and he associates them with two worldviews. The first is seen in the question, am I apart from the universe? Meaning whenever I look, I'm looking as if through a peephole on an unfolding universe. This is roughly objectivity. The second, am I part of the universe? Meaning whenever I act, I'm changing myself and the universe as well. This is usually associated with constructivism. You can also see in it a kind of realism, general realism, idealism pair. You might also read it as, if you remember, Mike Jackson's summary of Andrew Pickering at the last meeting, you can also see this in terms of enframing versus performativity. I think it's the same distinction drawn through slightly different metaphysical slices. So being apart from the world, being separate to the world, gives me objectivity, or the potential for it, which gives me a basis for moral codes. I can claim that such is true, that this is the way, these are the facts, or these are the way to resolve values, and so on. Being part of the world means I participate in it, and I'm changing the world and changing myself. I do not have the objective basis to legislate morality for others, but I do have both the responsibility and also the opportunity to act. So it becomes about action. So I'm just going to think of this as a kind of idealist-realist split for a moment, which is how this is usually interpreted. So this is put well in Ernst von Glasersfeld's radical constructivism, which is very closely related to Heinz von Foerster in terms of their development of their ideas. And von Glasersfeld puts it as that we cannot in principle check on whether our understanding of our experience corresponds to the world beyond our experience, because we cannot escape our experience to do so. So I can't in principle check whether my knowledge is a match with the between my experience, the world beyond my experience, the real, because I can't get outside of my experience to make the comparison. And von Glasersfeld moves us to the idea that we can get on perfectly well without checking on that. So in a certain sense, we don't really need epistemology. We can deal perfectly well by thinking in terms of our experience. So it sounds like being part of the world is what Heinz von Foerster is advocating or arguing for, although he doesn't really argue for it in this paper. He sort of just puts it there and is inviting you to choose it. Now, these questions are undecidable. He refers to them as an undecidable pair of questions. And he puts it like this: it is only the undecidable decisions that we can decide, because the decidable decisions are decided for us by the framework in which they are asked. It's only the undecidable decisions we can decide. The decidable decisions are decided for us by the framework in which they're asked. In principle, there's no way to resolve the question of am I part of or apart from the world. It requires a choice from us, so we become responsible for it and for its consequences. From this choice, von Foerster argues, we get different ways of engaging with the world, and these lead to different activations of ethics. Being part of the world, I'm an actor, a participant. I can't stand out outside of the world to judge. I have the ability to act and change things. I'm embedded in practical reasoning. If I'm apart from the world, I'm disengaged, but I can guide from an objective stance. I have the perspective of a judge. I'll come back to that again in a second. So the undecidable. This is a reference to Gödel, in mathematician, and perhaps some in the audience will be able to summarize this better than I can. Gödel shows that in formal mathematical systems, you cannot be both consistent and complete because of self-reference. So either, if you include the ability of a system to refer to itself, an inconsistency arises. But if you don't include that, you haven't exhausted the complete list of propositions you can make in that system. This is an example, a mathematical example of circular causality, cybernetics, creating paradoxical formulations, move in and out of different, each decision opens itself back up again. We can, so in Gödel's example, each decision opens itself back up. If it's consistent, it's incomplete. If it's complete, it's inconsistent. Now, similarly with von Foerster's questions, and again, this is where I'm differing from him. If I'm part of the world, my understanding is partial, so I do not know if I am part of the world or not. If I'm part of the world, my understanding is partial. I do not know if I'm part of the world or not. If I'm apart from the world, my understanding is objective, but this rested on a choice. So what status does that have? If I choose to see myself as apart from the world, my understanding is objective, but that rested on a choice. So taking hold of that, we would see second order cybernetics and radical constructivism. So von Glasersfeld, von Foerster and others with them, are not conventional, shouldn't be mapped to conventional constructivisms. The choice at the part of the world apart from the world is between a constructivist objectivist point of view. But their point, as I see it, or at least one of their points, is that whether I understand my engagement with the world in a constructivist or a realist way is something I have to construct. So I see their constructivism as one of genuinely of the second order, where I become responsible for whether I see this in one way or another, and that I can choose that in different ways at different times. The consequence of this is not as simple as the dismissal of objectivity, but a recognition that the status of objectivity is not itself objective. So to think objectivity is objective is a confusion of logical types. Because it's both uses the word objective, we think that one implies the other. Objectivity is something that we do. Scientific realism is something we do, right? It's a practice. And it's something we can do in more than one way. We need to be careful over assuming that objectivity is objective, because this can convince us that it is possible to be neutral without considering whose terms we are being neutral in. I think this is the first outcome of Heinz von Foerster's argument, that objectivity, science, research, epistemology, so on and so forth, involves and depends on ethics and politics and the personal. It is not a basis for it. But I think there's a bit more here. So I think his formulation, although he doesn't talk about this, also speaks to two aspects of what I might think of as the post-Enlightenment crisis in ethical philosophy. I'm thinking here of Alistair MacIntyre, for any of you who are familiar with him. So the Enlightenment attempted to find a rational basis for morality, one not based in community and tradition. And it failed to do that, which meant that the rational, with Kierkegaard in particular, the rational basis for morality ends up basing itself on choice. So ethics, despite having a tendency towards a universal obligation, ends up being highly personal. And you can see this tension through different philosophies and through different instances. And in Kierkegaard, for instance, the choice of the ethical, so to choose the universal or ethical or moral, this is all the same kit and caboodle for Kierkegaard, is to choose in terms of good and evil. It's not to choose the good, it's to choose in those terms. So that initial choice doesn't have those criteria. The second thing that I think von Foerster's point speaks to is a general problem with normative ethics when it comes to practice. So normative ethical theories, think here consequentialism, deontology, others, virtue ethics to some extent. These tend to take the perspective of the judge after the event, rather than that of a practical actor within the situation. Classical forms of normative ethics make no sense when we think of them in terms of practice. So if, for instance, context of design, we kind of know that optimization is a very naive thing to do because there are more than one criteria and they're incommensurable. How then would one use a consequentialist approach within a design decision?
5 minutes, Ben.
Heinz von Foerster seems to imply a personal responsibility ethics. So this is summed up in the maxims, only we can decide the undecidable, which is attributed to him, but isn't actually written anywhere that I found, perhaps something he said. And always act to increase the number of choices. And so we can think here of a kind of ethics which is kind of recognizable from the time he's speaking, which maybe reflects late 20th century pluralistic individualism. This is about taking responsibility, about the responsibility of being personal, and about there being a pluralism of ways to do this. This is kind of helpful. It's helpful in criticizing moralism, but it also has some problems when we come to, or limitations when we come to more complex systemic ethical questions. So for instance, in a conversation, whose responsibility is the outcome? Can it be divided up? If in a conversation we fall out, whose fault was that? Whose responsibility in an ecosystem is one part of it? And there are other limitations with personal responsibility ethics. For instance, one can be responsible but still be in the wrong, and I think we can see that the capacity for that in some of the current political discourse, or in consequentialist justifications of actions. Now, as a way forward, a way to kind of update this, I want to, rather than thinking of undecidability as a worldview choice, which is kind of how von Foerster approaches it, I want to think of it in the realm of practical action. So in design, we receive you typically receive a set of criteria or a brief, maybe a goal, and these are always incomplete and they're usually misleading. Design is not just a matter of fulfilling a brief. There's a need to question it, to explore it, and to redefine it, its aims, its criteria, and its scope. Perhaps a new building's needed, but maybe we could use an existing one differently. So designing is often about changing what the question is. And you can think of that as a kind of boundary question. So the judgment of how we draw a system environment boundary can be done in more than one way, and each way we do it has different opportunities and different ethical consequences. So in addition, what I want to propose is, in addition to deciding upon undecidable questions, which is a kind of taking responsibility for what I'm responsible for, which is what von Foerster asked us to do, that we also need to undecide decidable questions. By this, I mean putting into question the assumed and received frameworks that our decision-making is informed and structured by. So the frameworks that make decisions decidable for us. I don't mean that we need to delete all these, but by undeciding them, it makes it possible to decide upon them again. So this would be a form of acting that increases the number of undecidable decisions that we can resolve. This is my interpretation of always act, to increase the number of choices, not to have more things to choose between, but give yourself more choices that you need to make. So this includes deciding things that are not our responsibility, and notice the recursive structure that this has. So I have decided that X is not my responsibility, it's something I'm responsible for. The challenge of undecidability, so I'm wrapping up now, challenge of undecidability is not just to take responsibility for things we are responsible for, but to take responsibility for the extent and character of our responsibility and the consequences of this. So undeciding the decidable, I could think of as a kind of heuristic for critically examining or taking responsibility for the assumptions, the decidability of our decisions. They're inherited through the context in which we're living, increasing the number of choices that we have to make as a process of critique rather than a pluralization of options. Thank you.
We'd also have to take a deep breath after that, I think. I've certainly written down a vast quantity of notes. So thanks, Ben.
Thanks for listening.
Really gripping stuff. And sort of, I don't know which question to start with, really. So I think what I'll do is I shall start with a question I think was asked by Mr. Battle. Steve, do you want to read it out for you? Is that okay? So Steve, towards the end of that, wrote down, is von Foerster using decidability metaphorically? As you say, ethics is implicit in action, but undecidability is only relevant to formal, symbolic, representational systems. You'll see that in the chat, Ben. Do you have a sort of comment, reflection on that?
In the actual paper, von Foerster uses it actually quite loosely. He refers to it as, he's using it not as tightly as Gödel is using it. He is referring to decidable questions are decided for us by the framework in which we're asked. So I think it relates, maybe elsewhere he talks about unanswerable questions. I think it's fairly similar for him. So within asking a question, the language and the context often implies an answer, and I can also ask questions that don't have that quality. And he gives examples of that, such as what is the origin of the universe? I think I'm probably also using it metaphorically, but I think this is where cybernetics is allowing you to, what is that Pascal says, defensible, manipulation of defensible metaphors. So I think there is probably some care I need to take about how that then applies, but I'm picking out the way that a undecidable question might, or a particular question can reopen itself to remain a question. And that's what I'm trying to extract from the Gödel example and bring out of the von Foerster questions.
That makes sense, Steve. Steve, are you happy?
Yes, I particularly like this idea that it's a defensible metaphor. That's nice.
Brilliant, thank you. So Richard Berry, do you want to put your mic on, Richard, and ask your question?
Hi, Ben. Thanks. Really thought-provoking. I'm really talking about or exploring the idea of application of your proposals, which obviously would help test and kind of flush some more proposals out. But to what extent do the practical? Sorry, I'm reading the wrong bit. How can your proposals help the performance of public services? And we've seen this during the COVID crisis. I've seen it massively in my working life. Help the performance of public services and influence the development of more effective cultures. And I'm particularly interested in the ethics of decision making and decision making for the right reason. Defensible decision making may not always be the right reasons. So behavioral bureaucracies, I suppose, Ben. Yeah.
Could you just say what you mean by effective cultures for me, Richard?
Yeah, I'm really talking about things like the utilitarian kind of value, I suppose. If you're looking to serve the public, then there is something about delivering the best impact for the public. I hate to use the term optimization, having heard your comments about it, but we see countless examples of bureaucracies making decisions. Here's your solution, but we don't actually understand the problem. But nevertheless, we have a solution, and we'll call it a COVID app as a great example in recent history.
Yeah. Yeah, I always felt a bit, I can feel a bit overwhelmed by the application question. It'll just probably take me a while to have something be formulated, but I think the main thing at the kind of level we're talking would be shifting from answers to questions. And I think the kind of questions that we ask have huge consequences, and very often, especially in this kind of time of crisis, it's very tempting to just try and solve the various crises. But most of the crises we have are the result of the way various other answers that we had. So I think probably we have, I think we've got some scope to be open more to asking questions of what we're doing, and thinking, I think thinking of different practical reasoning doesn't have to lead to answers or solutions. It leads to actions. And I think actions can still leave open possibilities for acting differently. And I think how that might work out might be different in a different example situation. And I think there are practices that do this. So I'm obviously talking philosophically, but there are methods that allow those kind of questions to be asked. So one I'm interested in, which is influenced by some systems thinking and entering into design, is called giga mapping, which is a kind of graphic participative boundary critique done with a group. But I think that's a way of actually just questioning, like really questioning what you're trying to do, which I think is very valuable. Sorry, that's a bit of a abstract answer, but thank you.
No, not at all. I think it's the issue of rushing to solutions rather than understanding the problems, and how we make those decisions, Ben. And it's just something I'd like to explore with you. I can, please, at a later date. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, guys. Angus, you've got a question on the board at the moment. Do you want to read your question out?
You may, but I could just say that if something is hanging about, if something's there without any context at all, it kind of hangs about in midair. If you hear the words "the dog," so what the dog? But if you hear it in the context, there was a question, who ate the biscuits, and then the words "the dog" came, the dog suddenly has meaning. So the question I'm asking really is, to what extent do the practical and theoretical come together around another cybernetic principle that without context there is a lack of meaning and therefore a lack of decidability.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not totally sure. Angus, could you just say another sentence? Could you just locate that onto my, give me a little more context for that?
Okay, see, you've proved
Ben.
my point. You've proved my point. So context is a big word in cybernetics, and it'll be of more or less meaningfulness to people here. But everything has a context. A word in a sentence has a context. Sentence in a paragraph has a context, and so on. And a person walking along a street, they're in the context of that street. If they're on a pavement, it's a quiet road, nothing's going, there's not a single car in sight, you just walk across the road. It's a very busy traffic, you stop and you change and you wait and before you cross, and maybe you go and find a zebra crossing. So context changes what can be done, what the world is telling you, signifying to you, and how you respond to it. And therefore, any decision is always context dependent. And as soon as the context, and everybody creates their own context by looking at the situation, you know, they read out of the world the situation that they're in, and they make their own situation in the process. To what extent, therefore, are the decisions really something that, as long as you talk about it abstractly, you'll always have a problem. But whenever you go into an actual situation, very often the problem is resolved if you go in with enough precision and clarity.
Yes, thanks, Angus. So my thought on that is, I think it'd be important to pluralize this. So if I design a building on a street, if I think of this as the context is the street, versus I think of designing the building in the city, I could be designing it in the same place, right? I design a different building. And if I think of it in the world, I might design a different one. So I think we assume a context, let's get this right, we assume a reading of a context, which is implied in a situation. This is why I don't think it's coming from a worldview choice. So I think I'm inheriting a certain context, and very often I'm not taking responsibility for that because I don't think it's mine. I treat it as given. But there's a lot of things in that which are not great, right? A lot of the context, social context that we're inheriting has lots of pretty bad assumptions built into it, which, so how can I take control of the context in which I'm acting by, so that I become, I'm actively taking responsibility for the frameworks in which I'm making my choices. Yeah. So do I take, as a designer, I would think about, is it appropriate to, which context am I designing this building in? And I can design it in more than one, of course, which is probably what I do if I'm a good designer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angus.
So in my head, as I was wandering around earlier thinking about this evening, I was thinking to myself, do I need to define epistemology and ontology for the audience that we have here tonight? And if I do, then I should. Because I find myself then thinking, as Ben was talking about, Ben, is it separate or is it symbiotic? The structure you've set up says we're either separate from or we're part of. But if we're symbiotic, then maybe we're both. And if we're sentient beings in a symbiotic situation, we're both part of the situation and capable of observing the situation, albeit perhaps not objectively. So does that help us resolve it, or does it make it worse?
I think that the interesting thing about treating the question as undecidable is that it becomes something you can choose in different contexts. And this is something that I got from Ranulph. He would talk about this as a choice of being in one camp or another, but also another one which was sitting on the fence, and another which was maintaining the fence, and another which was maintaining the field the fence was on. And these were positions that allowed others to take perspectives, but also that one could decide differently at different times. So von Foerster, again, this is from Ranulph, I don't know if I can quote this from somewhere. He told me that von Foerster used the metaphor of like the metro system to talk about technologies. So that kind of certain science and technologies, you know, they it's kind of like the metro, right? You can use them to do something. These shortcuts are easier at certain times because you don't always want to be talking about everything. So, but that's to put the whole question within a realm of action, right? So it's not, it sounds like it makes things theoretical, but it's a whole lot of theory in order to simplify everything. So you're just acting.
Okay, thank you. And Chris Heald, you're coming in with a really interesting one there. I can see you're a little bit in the dark, my friend. Do you want to articulate your question for Ben? We'll make this the last one, I think, before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, Ben talked a bit about boundaries and where to draw them. So the question I was prompted when he was talking in response to the last question was, presumably for the greater good, long term of all, common good, whatever you want to call it, moral purpose, we have to draw that context as broadly as we can possibly understand it.
I think, yeah, let's just work with that a little bit. So broad could mean more than one thing. Broad could mean bigger, but we could also interpret that as a broader set. If we pluralize contexts, we could also set this as a broader capacity for context. So for instance, you know, there are ethical systems in design, something called responsive cohesion, which is kind of, you know, it's an idea of an ethical principle, but there's an idea it should scale up, right? So you really have to deal with the needs of the ecosystem have to trump the needs of the individual if they come into conflict. So maybe, but on the other hand, I don't think it's necessarily always about scale. It probably depends how we're doing that. And I think there's some things that are quite to do with maybe individual identity that are also really effective on the larger scale that we're seeing today. So I think I kind of definitely agree, but I think broad also needs to be have its own conversation, right? How do we be broad? It's a bit like universal or neutral. How do we do that? What are the consequences?
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. So thank you all very much. Thanks for the questions. Thanks, Ben, for the talk, which we have recorded, by the way, just in case you're unaware that you are being recorded, everybody, at the moment. So can we wave our jewellery, clap our hands, say thank you to Ben in the usual way, please? You can see you're being applauded, Ben. Thank you very much. Good. Wow. So I suspect we're going to change direction reasonably dramatically at this point. Louise, I'm looking at you up in my top left-hand corner. I should warn you, Louise, that you have, I think, one serving police officer and one retired police officer in the audience. So anything you say about policing will be taken out of whatever constitutes context in this conversation and reinterpreted for the purposes that the officers choose to apply them to. Everybody, I'm delighted to introduce Louise Cook. Louise is a prof at Loughborough University, and I've had the joy of working with her over, I think, about 10 or 12 years now. From time to time, she invites me in to irritate her students, which I have great success and pleasure in doing. Louise has, in a more practical context, has obviously been working with police force. I think it was Leicestershire, if I'm nodding my head correctly at the right time, or East Midlands. Well, you can talk about it, Louise, and perhaps carry on the introduction from there. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, John, and thanks for offering me the opportunity to come along this evening. And good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have put together some slides, and I'm going to try sharing my screen, and hopefully you will be able to see them. As John said, this talk will be actually probably a bit more sort of practically focused, but I think hopefully it will still raise some interesting questions. So, let's get it onto slide share. I'll have to do it this way. Okay, can everybody see the slides? Okay, good. Okay, yes, as John said, when I said to him that I thought I would like to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done with various police forces, he didn't actually advise me that there would be police officers in the audience. So I just hope that I'm not going to offend anyone. But what I really want to do is just give a broad overview of some of the work that I've done, and then think about, you know, what the relevance of that is in terms of cybernetics. So I'll give a bit of background to myself and a bit of context of the research. We've just been talking about context, a few examples of some projects I've been working on, and then bringing together some of the common themes that have arisen from those. And hopefully that will prompt a discussion in terms of the relevance of cybernetics, in particular to the management of information and knowledge in policing. So a bit about me, I'll try and keep quite brief here. I did my bachelor's degree at Loughborough University, and I had quite a sort of broad career working in different roles. As you can see, I bounced back to Loughborough, as people tend to do my PhD, which looked at regulation of the internet, because I'm very interested in issues around information ethics, information policy, and so on. Worked for a while at City University in London, and then came back to Loughborough, where I am Professor of Information and Knowledge Management. So a bit of context in terms of policing and information knowledge management. We know that effective policing depends on, you know, access to high quality data, information, knowledge, and intelligence, and so on. And yet, actually, when you look at what goes on within police forces, there are a lot of problems in that area. For instance, one of them might be that there are many different non-interoperable systems, not just within a particular police force, but across the different sort of police forces in the UK. And generally, a sort of a lack of uniformity, again, within a specific force and across forces. So, you know, a lot of reinventing the wheel, a lot of, you know, different approaches taken to the same thing, and this can cause problems. And in addition, the sort of hierarchical structure that tends, and bureaucratic sort of culture that tends to prevail in police and law enforcement agencies tends to inhibit knowledge sharing. So there's this idea of a, you know, need to know basis rather than, you know, sort of good to know basis. And one other aspect that you know seems to be quite prevalent is this lack of interagency knowledge sharing with other sort of emergency services. So whether it's the paramedics or the fire rescue services and so on, or health services, and some of that is cultural. So I mean, there's a very different organizational culture, and you know, as Ben was talking about purpose, a very different purpose behind, say, a health agency to a law enforcement agency, and that can inhibit sort of knowledge sharing, but there's also all kinds of aspects in terms of data protection, and sometimes quite a lot of hiding behind data protection legislation. So it's this idea, no, we can't, we can't divulge anything, rather than looking at, well, what can we share and how can we share it? So there's an assumption behind it that we can't do things rather than that we can do things. So the very first project that I was involved in that involved the police was with regard to the Freedom of Information Act, which came into force in the UK in 2005. And police forces had 5 years of warning to sort of prepare for that. We carried out just a very small study with 2 East Midlands police forces. And we really wanted to sort of try and assess the impact, both in terms of the impact on the police forces themselves and their sort of information knowledge management practices. But one of the things that came out of it, which we weren't necessarily looking for, was this idea of the changed balance of power between the media and the police. So what we found, for instance, in one force was that 46% of the freedom of information requests that they received came from the media themselves, looking for stories. And it also meant that whereas sort of previously the media had been dependent on the police to provide them with what they'd call sort of crime and crash stories, they were now able to sort of leverage, their own sort of power in terms of finding out what was going on. And as another interesting point that came out of that work, apart from the massive professionalization of communication that it led to, and the massive amount of person hours that are now spent on records management and complying with freedom of information legislation, was this idea of this distinction between what is in the public interest, which is a reason that you can make a freedom of request act, a freedom of information request from a public authority, and this notion of in which the public might be interested. So the public is interested in all kinds of sort of sordid things, but there is not necessarily a genuine public interest in having access to that information. The next big project, and please, if I'm going too fast or I'm saying something that isn't clear, please feel free to interrupt me. But the next big project we got involved in was one on putting mobile data terminals in police response cars. Now, this happened around the time when the UK government threw a lot of money at police forces to invest in mobile technology. And what we found was that many police forces just went out and bought a whole lot of Blackberries, which then got put in people's lockers and never to see the light of day again. The police force that we worked with, I would like to say, I think we're a lot more reflective and, followed a greater sort of due diligence process in researching a solution. But before I sort of go into the solution, I'll say a little bit more about the problem, because I think this is quite important, and quite important from a cybernetic perspective. So what we found when we first started working with this particular police force, that when an incident was reported and a police officer was sent out in response, he or she would go out, take a statement from the victim, writing it down in a notebook. They would then drive back to the police station, where they would wait for a computer to be free, because there weren't enough computers to go around. So they were sitting around in the station waiting for a computer. And whilst they're there, they'd have a cup of tea with their mates and, a quick catch up and a chat. And then they would have to type up the report on the computer. And that report then got faxed to the Crime Intelligence Bureau, who would then have to input it onto the system, which obviously represents a lot of duplication of effort, a lot of time wasted, and a lot of potential for errors to be made along the way, particularly in data quality. So the solution that we came up with was something called the Panasonic Toughbook, which was just a very rugged laptop that could be fitted into the response cars. And the advantage of this was that it actually mirrored the same systems that the police officers had access to in the station. So it had the same interface, it looked the same, they already knew how to use it in effect. And that, I think, massively benefited the take up. And it was user-friendly in comparison with a very small mobile device. Did have some implications for business processes. One of the things that we found was that it upset the sort of command and control people who sort of send out the response cars to incidents, because previously they had been the ones who would select which officer would be sent to which incident. What you found now was that whilst on the move, the officers could see what incidents were coming up, and if they were maybe towards the end of their shift, they'd see that there was a minor incident round the corner. So, you know, well, I'll go and attend to that so that I'll be home in time for tea. And that obviously upset some individuals, because again, it was this, well, it's both change and it's a change in the balance of power. And there were implications, negative implications in some ways for knowledge sharing, because although, you know, I talked about this time, you know, having a cup of tea in the station as being a waste of time, actually, you know, a lot of that very valuable knowledge sharing, hints, tips, intelligence and so on would be shared during those moments. And that was something that they really hadn't factored in. So now the mantra was, you know, that the sergeant would send them out and he didn't want to see them again till the end of the day, a bit like the, you know, the old Bobby on the beat kind of thing. Whereas actually there was a lot of value in having them come back to the station at certain points. I've put a however there, which is just a rider to this from my own personal experience, a story. About 2 months ago, our doorbell rang at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we went down thinking, you know, who on earth, nobody calls us, comes here at 3 o'clock in the morning. And when we opened the door, we found a little old white-haired lady in pink flannelette pajamas and slippers carrying a holdall, and she didn't know where she was. And we asked her where she lived, and she said Carlisle, and bearing in mind that this was in Loughborough. She wasn't able to tell us what had happened, but to cut a long story short, she was visiting her son and daughter-in-law, and she had woken up in the middle of the night confused and had thought that she would go home and then didn't know where she was. Because she was not able to tell us this, or where we could rehome her, we had to call the police, obviously. So we rang the non-emergency number, and 2 police constables came out. They were brilliant with her, I have to say. They were absolutely fantastic. But the first thing they did was draw out a notebook from their pocket and start writing in the notebook. So I don't know whether that was just a one-off thing, and I didn't think it was appropriate at that exact point in time to start asking them what they'd done with their Panasonic Toughbook, or whether the project has been abandoned and is no longer considered viable. I don't know. But I just thought it was quite interesting to see that things seem to have gone full circle. Right. I'll try not to take too much time with each of these projects, because obviously, you know, we must stick to time. But another project was the Police National Database project, and it might well be that there are members of the audience who can tell me more information on what's happened with that subsequently, because we had a PhD student who was working with what was then the National Policing Improvement Agency on the Police National Database project, not to be confused with the Police National Computer. This was much more for sort of soft intelligence, and was set up following the Bichard inquiry into the Soham child murders, where information had got missed and intelligence had got missed because it crossed the borders of two different police forces. So this was an attempt to try to sort of get a consistent sort of intelligence database that was shared by all the forces. But one of the problems that we had with this project was that just towards the end of the project, the MPIA was disbanded. The database, as I understand it, is now sort of rests with the College of Policing, but I actually have no idea in terms of how well used it is now, or whether it's yet another of these initiatives that start off with a lot of enthusiasm and then kind of get abandoned. We also were involved in a project that tried to get a multi-agency information sharing hub related to reports of antisocial behaviour. And this was involving the local police force, the local authority, the health service, and so on. But we found two major, it never really was effective. And the reason for that primarily related to ownership of systems. So the local authority wanted to use their system and the police wanted to use their system. And there was quite a lot of power struggles going on. And, you know, again, politics, and again, this issue of data protection as well. You know, we can't share data. So although it was an interesting project to work on in terms of seeing, you know, sort of the different perspectives of different players, it never actually came to fruition. And then more latterly, I've worked on a couple of projects which have been more to do with sort of data science and data mapping. Again, another PhD student who was interested in repeat victimization in motor vehicle crime. So that's defined as either theft of a motor vehicle, theft from a motor vehicle, aggravated vehicle taking, and attempted theft of a motor vehicle or from a motor vehicle. And he did a range of different work, including sort of analysing the open crime data, which incidentally everybody has access to. It is open, and you know, he used GIS mapping to identify both geographical hotspots but also temporal patterns. And one of the interesting things, or surprising things to me, that came out of that was that a key time for having being a victim of vehicle crime, which you would assume is 3 o'clock in the morning, was actually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this was either theft from car parks when people are shopping, or it's after the school run, the parents come home, chuck the keys in the kitchen, go off and play with the children or do things with the children, and don't lock the front door. Somebody comes in quickly, whips the keys out, and that's it. So, you know, it was just a new insight into sort of patterns of crime that I hadn't thought about. But what was a really interesting part of this project, though, was that he managed to secure interviews with former offenders who are currently on probation, because he wanted to know about their thought patterns and what kind of encouraged them to get involved in vehicle crimes. And he would show them certain photographs of particular sort of scenes, street scenes, and ask them questions about what would it, you know, what does this scene tell you, you know, if you were going to perpetrate a vehicle crime. And again, there were lots of interesting insights that came out of that. But he also used data to sort of try and model and predict future crime patterns and what would happen if the response to from the police was changed in any particular way. So if you put more officers in this area or fewer officers in that area, you know, what impact would that have? And I've just put the last bullet point there, soccer. Again, it was just an interesting, probably not surprising to many people here, but one thing that came out of this was just the extent to which vehicle crime is an organized crime. And there was he uncovered a whole supply chain of vehicles being stolen to order in order to, you know, sort of meet the demand from particular customers, if you want to call it that. And the final project that I want to talk about is that we've been doing some work on risk assessment in custody suites. So obviously when a potential sort of offender comes into custody, a risk assessment is carried out, which will determine what observation level they are put on whilst they're still in the custody suites, because it is the custody officer's responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of that individual. But equally, if they put all individuals on very high observation levels, then there's a significant resource implication for that. So the aim is to try to get the correct observation level that keeps people safe, but doesn't use up too much resources. And she did statistical analysis from custody records, but she also did some ethnographic observation in custody suites. And she's looked at the various custody risk assessment tools that are used. And she's also done some interviews with custody officers to see how those are applied. And again, one of the interesting things here is this lack of uniformity of approaches. So although the College of Policing does provide some official guidance, actually this is applied in very different ways in different forces, and arguably it has some serious omissions. So the official guidance omits questions on things like alcohol intoxication, I think head injury as well, and so on, you know, things that actually are really key that the custody officer needs to know. So there's a lack of both of sort of the kind of questions that are answered, but there's also a lack of uniformity in terms of the degree of, if you like, cautiousness that different forces will, or the level of a risk that different forces will accept. So just to draw together from all these projects, some of the things that I've sort of reflected on as kind of common themes. First of all, you know, we have found that there's a real appetite amongst the police forces. You know, they are interested in trying to engage with evidence-based practice and collaborate with academia. But it tends to be, and often sometimes this is to do with personnel, sometimes it's to do with funding. It tends to be seen as a one-off project, you know, so we'll do the mobile data technologies project, we'll do the police national database project and that. And when that project comes to an end, they move on to something else, but there's not much attention to the sort of sustainability of those solutions. And I think also this focus on the technological solutions, but less emphasis on the human, social and cultural issues, which were absolutely key. And I can give an example from the mobile data project there, that we held some focus groups, stroke workshops, with the officers who had been selected for the pilot project to, and they were going to be the champions of the project. And we you know, and these were arranged for us by the force, and who they selected the personnel, and you know, they came to the room at the required time and date, and they didn't know why they were there. They hadn't actually been told that they would been selected for this project. They hadn't been told anything about it. They hadn't been consulted on it. And, you know, initially, I think we spent probably the first half of the day just overcoming that resistance to, you know, being involved in something which they knew nothing about. Whereas had they been properly prepared for it, I think, you know, we would have probably been able to hit the ground running a bit more. But yes, new technologies hold implications for current business processes. Wherever you make a change to technology, it's going to change somebody's job somewhere or how something is done somewhere. And I wouldn't want to underestimate the impact of politics within these sorts of initiatives, both at national, regional, and local levels, even within an individual force or an individual team. You know, that can have a make or break impact. So rather than put myself in the firing line like Ben did, I'm leaving you all with a question. I would be interested to know what you think about how a cybernetic understanding might inform information and knowledge management practices in policing. What can we learn from cybernetics that might actually address some of these issues or provide some improvements to these kind of concerns? And on that, I will say thank you for listening, and I'm happy to engage in discussion, questions, and so on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise. If you unshare your screen at this point, so we can see all the happy smiling faces. I have 9 questions written down, so if there aren't any from the floor, there will be plenty from me. But let's start by inviting questions, comments, observations from the audience.
Bernard Scott, I'd just like to comment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Louise. I thought it was a wonderful presentation. And I read the whole story as applied cybernetics. This is communication and control in complex systems. I'm old enough to have an experience of working in public institutions and doing projects similar to yours on what is now referred to as knowledge management and so on. It's just a little bit depressing to see that you know, the cultural problems are still there, or the management of the cultural issues are still there. I mean, people have been. I can go back to the 60s, working with Gordon Pass when he had a project with the then Home Office on you know, police intelligence gathering. I mean, people are running projects for decades. Thankfully, the technology is really making things more possible. And I just say thank you very much for this update on what's happening in your sector. I should final comment. I did work with the MOD at the Defence Academy, and we ran a few seminars on scaling up e-learning. This is about 10, 15 years ago. And we got people from several different sectors, including from the police, who were doing their bit to try and apply technologies to basically manage the knowledge, manage the communications. So anyway, thank you and good luck.
Thanks.
Good work.
Thank you, Bernard. Steve Battle, you've come in again with another great, I'm not quite sure whether it's a question or a comment or a bit of both, but would you like to talk directly to Louise, please?
All right. I like to get in early with my questions. Great talk. Thank you, Louise. So yeah, I'm a great fan of open data. My students have used the open crime data in the past, so it's a fantastic resource. But maybe is knowledge sharing always a good thing? You know, so I wondered, you were asking what have we got in cybernetics that's relevant? So Stafford Beer's kind of ideas about variety engineering with kind of sometimes you need to attenuate knowledge rather than amplify it.
I mean, absolutely, I would agree with that. I mean, and I think particularly this is pertinent to things like organizational culture. So, you know, sometimes there's a need to unlearn the way we do things around here. and unlearn the kind of, received assumptions and philosophies and so on. And yeah, knowledge is only as good as the quality of the knowledge and the relevance of the knowledge and the accuracy of the knowledge and so on. So sharing bad knowledge, you're actually creating more of a bad thing rather than more of a good thing. So yeah, it isn't something that you should just take as a given that knowledge sharing is always a good thing. I would agree with that. Yeah.
Thanks, Louise. And Christopher Singer, much of that's been going through my head. So would you like to share your observation at this point, please?
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to Ben's presentation earlier, and that is coming back to what is the problem that's trying to be fixed in the first place. And I'm sure Rich will bear me out on this, that we've seen the application of many things. And in fact, I think the laptops in the police cars was a case in point, where we were unclear about what the problem was that we were trying to fix. And as a consequence, the solution that was provided was completely and utterly inappropriate because it just didn't fit the problem. And I think the understanding of the problem, and I think the cybernetics approach in terms of understanding what the problem is, and then applying that ethical element to the desirability of a fix to that particular problem. I think your example in relation to the lady knocking on the door is a really interesting one. I think probably Rich again will bear me out on this, because at its root, is that a policing problem?
Well, again, that relates right back to what is the purpose of policing, and until you've kind of resolved that, then it's very difficult to know. In theory, one would say it was really more of a social care problem, but we didn't know what to do, who to phone. We phoned them and they responded. They were brilliant. And I think that the advantage that they had over maybe perhaps any other agency was that they did have access to the systems needed to trace back this lady's family, and eventually able to get in touch with, I think, her son in Carlisle, who was able to put them in touch with her son-in-law in Loughborough, and gradually put the pieces of the jigsaw together.
And actually, sure. So, and that's that's an interesting one in terms of the context now, because it always amused me that policing runs projects under Prince methodology, projects in a controlled environment. Policing is not a controlled environment. And your example there is a really good example of why it's not a controlled environment, as is COVID now, because policing has stepped into an environment that actually, arguably, has got nothing to do with policing at all. And yet it attempts to enforce solutions on itself by saying it operates in a controlled environment. It doesn't. And I think the cybernetics thought process or the cybernetics process in relation to that offers opportunity for policing to start thinking differently about the environment within which it operates, and then the desirability of the outcomes that it's seeking to achieve. That for me is where I think it can be applied.
I think it's very interesting, this thing about, well, what is the problem to be solved? And it kind of goes back to when I was doing my PhD, I was using something called garbage can theory. I don't know whether that's familiar to everyone here, but, and it was this idea of a solution looking for a problem. So you want to do something, so you invent a problem that gives you, if you like, the sort of freedom to implement that particular solution. So
I think you just appealed to every bureaucrat in the room there, Louise. So Chris Heald, I think you wanted to come in with a comment, and then Jonathan Randall.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, Louise. So my comment really, because I had direct involvement with NPIA, so I saw that project from another angle. And I think it's highly relevant for systems thinking, cybernetics, and my kind of 2 or 3 observations about it would be that while there was some good intention in the ideas that of having a national system there, what was underestimated was the the strength and power of the people in the existing system who would resist it. And ultimately, that's what happened to MPIA. It was shut down because those in political positions of power, decided they did not want to do it. And secondly, it underestimated the identity and strength of the 42 separate forces, because it cut across their histories and their purpose and their beings. So there was some kind of really strong messages about, from a kind of systems point of view, that were not thought through at the beginning of a project, that was a lot driven by a desire to kind of share information without thinking about the kind of cultural and systemic dimensions.
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
Yeah. That's absolutely, that mirrors totally what the student found in terms of the political issues, and basically that it fell apart when it came to trying to get the different forces on board and engaged with it, and that definitely, certainly mirrors what we seem to find. So that's really interesting to know. Thank you.
Jonathan Randall, I think you wanted to comment as well.
Yeah, just an observation. It was really an aspect of the attenuation of knowledge principle. A colleague of mine was in the army, and about 15 years ago was heavily involved in diversity training. And an observation he relayed to me from that time was that peers of his in the police force were having a much more difficult job, but that was because the time in service in the armed forces was far shorter than the police. So it's this thing of actually, with a faster refresh rate of human beings who don't know the existing cultural ways of doing things, actually accelerated the culture change there.
Yeah, I think that is definitely something that, and I think that change is happening, actually. I mean, I wouldn't say that, that no progress has been made or that no change is happening. But it's very slow, and it's a bit like, pushing water uphill. But again, I think as more younger people and maybe more graduates enter the force, I don't know what difference that will make, but it might actually change the sort of the cultural mix a bit. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. That was great. Thank you.
Angus, you're waving your hand desperately. I know I've got your note here, so in you go.
Desperately. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to be desperate. Louise, thank you very much. That was really interesting. And you sort of put out a provocative question. How would we respond to it? So I wanted to very quickly give a few suggestions to see how they go down. And some of them might be a little bit counterintuitive. The first is a principle from someone called Bateson. What is the pattern that connects? So we had 5 or 6 different cases. And so one of the first questions would be, looking at each of them, and this is the second principle, there wasn't really ever enough detail in any of them to be able to say anything, because it was high level, it was very brief. So you'd never aim to try and solve anything or say what was going on with such a small amount of detail. But there might be some pattern that you know about across all of those that you could share. So that's 2 principles. You've got to go into close and intimate detail in order to solve things. And is there a pattern that connects? Third thing, the problem that people think they have, if there's a difficulty in solving it, the problem is never the problem. Whatever you think is the problem is definitely not the problem. And not only that, you should never allow it to be the problem. So I do work in problem solving, and I've been schooled. There's a whole school that solves very knotty problems very quickly. And the first thing you've got to learn is the problem is never, ever, ever the problem. What you do have to do is to understand very precisely what is the outcome you want to have. Very, 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 very precise description in acute detail. And the $1 million question is a very good one. It indicates this, to be used sparingly, but in the right way. It's the equivalent of the $1 million question, and it's the what if happens if you come home from holiday question. You go away on holiday, you come back, and by lo and behold, by miracle, everything you want has been solved. It's just exactly. And the question is, how would you know that everything that you wanted to have happen was actually happening? How would you know? Next thing is that you might need to switch around the way you think about things. So there's a tendency to blame the workforce, blame the policeman, blame the this, blame the that. Maybe you have to switch the problem around. Amazon doesn't have any problem on the whole in getting people to use Amazon. It has no real problem. We have amongst our membership, and I'm glad to say he's helping out in designing our website, and Steve is also helping with our new website. As someone who is a leading designer for Amazon. So we have some intimate conversations. And Amazon is a company that for more than 20 years has been very brilliant at designing things that people just intuitively work with and want and so on. And that leads to the last principle, which is that very, very well designed cybernetic solutions produce no resistance. Every solution you design where you think this is going to produce resistance, therefore we've got to overcome the resistance, is already badly designed. If it's well designed, it will produce no resistance whatsoever. And that might also include not just the thing, but also how the thing is introduced, how it's contextualized, how it's brought over, what goes on. But it should produce zero resistance. It might produce the odd question. It might not even do that. But it should be something that people see as a help in their lives, help in their jobs, help them to do a better job in some way. Otherwise, you'll always get resistance and then you'll always get problems. And having been around in the IT world for some years, I've probably created a few of those. I've certainly seen quite a few.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really interesting and really helpful. And yeah, I would agree in particular about the point about resistance, that you know, a lot of the issues were, you know, it wasn't actually to do with the technology. It wasn't to do with you know, it was to do with the fact that nobody in that room understood what the benefit to them was of these, you know, making this change. Once they understood that, they actually got very enthusiastic about it, you know, and the whole mood in the room changed. But it is, yes, people want to know what's in it for them, really, and why they should bother. So I would.
So I'm listening to that, and I'm going to sort of take you back and desperately try and make a link that reaffirms the link between what you've had to say and what Ben was saying a little bit earlier, because you talked, you know, in my language, you were talking about organizations as adaptive systems, and I'm thinking, well, you know, am I part of the system, or am I observing the system, or in fact, am I both? Both part of the system and observing the system, and perhaps even observing myself as part of the system, which makes my life incredibly complicated. But then we get and then you said, and we get inconsistency of approach. So because we have the professionalism on the one hand that you referred to sort of fairly early on, which conditions people perhaps to behave in particular ways and follow the process. On the other hand, I've got me learning as part of the system and saying, but that doesn't work. And you talked about evidence-based practice, but I wondered how much of that might be experience-based practice rather than evidence-based practice in a lot of contexts. And then I got to the point of unlearning. So actually, you made the point that we have to unlearn maybe the way the organization works in order to be able to make it do the things we wanted to do, and to adopt Angus's, it's painless, look, everybody wants to do it because we've designed it right. So do we connect the notion of unlearning with the notion of undeciding the decidable? So yeah, that we bring those two very different and very differently structured thought processes together in a way that is actually, if we want to get our organization, our system to change, the mechanism that we have to do that is to legitimate the challenge to the way that things are done. And yes, I saw that, Mr. Berry. I'll bring you in just a second. So does that sort of make sense as a comment or an observation? Ben, you want to come in, then we'll go to Richard, then back to Louise, if that's okay. So Ben, go first.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. So there's another passage in Heinz von Foerster paper, which I think is very powerful. It's quite similar. I think he means the same kind of thing. He talks about answerable and unanswerable questions, and he does this in the context of education, and it's a kind of very similar notion to, I think, the notion of deschooling. And so he says there are questions that have answers, there are questions that are unanswerable. Imagine an education system where you get asked questions that don't have answers, which I find very powerful, right? So he has this other great example of a child who is asked the question what 2 + 2 equals, and they answer green, and they get admonished for this. And he's really cross they get admonished, right? Because the proper response as a teacher should be, that's incredibly interesting that the answer is green. I really have to find out why that's the answer, right? That's this. So I think this, deschooling, unlearning, asking questions that don't have answers, these are very powerful things to be doing.
Thanks, Ben. Now, Richard, you've already been outed by Mr. Singer as the other policeman in the room, so you can no longer hide. What a comment.
Thanks, John. Louise, thank you. What a great presentation, and colleagues, a great discussion afterwards. I stuck up earlier, and thanks, Bernard, for your point. Absolutum obsoletum from Stafford Beer. If it's built and working, it's probably out of date. It was just to throw in the chaos grenade, really, Louise. Your studies all took place in a relatively stable environment for policing, where data was relatively stable. We could manage it. We don't have the tsunami of, or the explosion, to use someone else's words, of data that we now have to contend with. And you see this kind of amplification of the knowledge management problems. And I know you know my research, and I'm seeing a police service. Sorry, I'm seeing law enforcement. So I'll go wider than policing. Really in almost an entropic state, or moving towards an entropic state, where noise outstrips the signal. People really don't understand what the questions are, and certainly where to find clues around answers. And I think Chris really made a lovely point around, the Treasury Green Book of Transformation, projects in controlled environments. You see increasingly, and this is central government politics, you see this constant drive to be ultimately accountable and deliver something. It's a bit like the police digital strategy in 2015. It was a 3G strategy built in a 4G setting for a 5G environment. It was obsolete before anything was actually delivered, and consequently nothing was delivered. And things like the Police Transformation Fund, £400 million later, deliver very, very little. And your example around mobile data was actually a Tony Blair good idea, I think, that we're all going to give the police mobile data, but we don't actually know what problem we're looking to solve. So there's some really interesting themes that have come out in the discussion. For me, there's something around complex adaptive systems, and a very different style of management, a very different approach to delivering policing. And maybe that entropy will start to kind of create that environment. I think the other point, and it's a very practical one, to use your missing person, the empirical reality explained to me recently is that policing tends to spend more time tracing the top 10 repeat missing children than it does investigating burglary. So when you talk about the purpose of policing, the functions of police, to go right back to its roots, and the Greek sort of definition of the nation state, or the city state. I think that entropy really also starts to raise questions of, so what does policing look like in this increasingly complex, adaptive, fluid knowledge management environments? And I think, you know, if you went back to look at it now and looked at mobile data now, you'd see layers and layers of complexity, and probably it would be really interesting to hear your views, actually. I'd welcome that. Yeah.
So Louise, any comment from you?
Yeah, well, first of all, to say yes, actually, I would be very interested to actually revisit and see what's actually happening on the ground. I absolutely agree about the idea of policing as an adaptive system, and that was the kind of the word that came to my mind. And, you know, also this idea of trying to understand the purpose of policing, and that in a way that is fundamental before you can really answer any of the questions, if you can answer the questions.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to say thank you properly to Louise, and can we say thank you in the usual manner, please, just so she can see us all clapping. Thank you, Louise, and again, thanks again, Ben, for your great contribution. And everybody, I think we elevated the level of discussion this time compared with last time, so we can start to look forward to the 9th of December, when we do this again, when Angus will be talking to us about why cybernetics is so important. So I guess a development, a continuation of a little bit of what we might have heard early this afternoon. And Peter Kavalek, also from Loughborough, will be talking, I can't even say this word, Peter will be talking about Donna Haraway's CHTHULUCENE. I've no idea how to pronounce it. Should be talking about cybernetic well-being and the future of the planet. So just as we go into Christmas, a sort of minor discourse on what the future of planet Earth may well be. So that's on the 9th of December, and you can sign up now online for that on Eventbrite, the same place you did for this. Angus, I believe you want to make a pitch as well for a minute?
Yes, thank you. We have a second series also going on with the Cybernetics Society, a second SibSite series called Insight. A number of you have already booked on these. Coming up, new, we have it's coming up later this month on the 24th. Turns out I'm appearing more than once, but I'm in a conversation with one of our recent honorary fellows who's worked with BT and other companies. Particularly, he built a VSM model for the whole of BT. And we're in conversation. We have regular meetings talking about what's involved in systems and modeling and organization to help organizations work more efficiently and help people to get more, amplify the freedom or variety that people are working with. So we'll be having a conversation around that. It's a bit of a smart aleck title, Corporate Seagulls, Smart Alecks and Enterprise Antics. So it's talking about corporate seagulls are people who fly in and out and dump shit on the way, and smart alecks are the cyberneticians who think they know all of the answers, and enterprise antics are all the things that go on in organizations, and we try and bring a cybernetic lens to it. And in December 22nd, we're going to have a drama session. A professor from Canada is going to lead a session. He's a cybernetician and he's a director, and he's running a drama session to look at the cybernetics of conflict and relationship and so on in an organizational setting. And that will be different and a little warm up for Christmas. And in January, it's not yet up yet, but in January, we have a session on perceptual control theory, which is, I think, an incredibly exciting way of understanding human behavior and action and how things happen. And it's transformative for making sense of how people behave.
Brilliant, thank you, Angus. So a society that was hiding itself for quite some time is now doing some very exciting and different and engaging things. And so you're mostly still here. So I guess most of you have been engaged. I hope you've been informed and entertained to at least some degree. And I see everybody is still awake, which is always encouraging 2 hours in. So thank you all very much for turning up. I hope to see all of you and more again next month. And a particular thanks to Angus for doing all the admin stuff in the background as ever, and to Ben and Louise for great contributions to the evening. Thanks very much, and see you again soon.
Thank you.